Again, thank you so much, everyone, for sharing your perspective and experience in realizing virtual reality, augmented reality, and mixed reality technologies from the design to operation. I would like to quickly summarize, because we heard a variety of different use cases from different perspectives of the client, designer, and builder. We heard early design phase, the design review for new builds, as well as renovation projects, and how it's important to understand the design intent and communicate it effectively. Then we heard later, while we are installing the equipment and the components in the field, how we can verify the installation, the accuracy through augmented reality and mixed reality. And then we heard, okay, now we are inside the building and operating, but our needs are changing. And with Meta, we heard how actually workplace can be redesigned to increase effectiveness and inclusiveness of the workplace. And then for renovation, because our buildings need modernization and renovation in the life cycle, and we heard from that perspective as well. Thank you so much again. And I would like to get us started with a question, because we are lucky to have both the client, designer, and builder perspective here. Could you talk about your respective perspectives on what is the role of a client, designer, and builder to make sure the pilot projects of extended reality, AR, MR, and VR can move from the pilot phase to large-scale adoption, and making this in a really effective way and impactful way on the project?
So maybe I'll start from the client side. I think one of the biggest challenges is how we heard that it's a lot of cost and it's a lot of time. And so often we move so quickly that building that into a schedule is either not feasible or it's happening after the fact. And so, like we complete a project and we're really excited about that outcome, the physical space, but it's taking the time to look back and make sure that whatever has been modeled is like to par.
Maybe I'll just add in. I always think my role on a project is to set expectations really clearly. If everyone understands the expectations, we can be successful. And so as the owner, if we see that there's, meaningful value, it's setting the stage that everyone can accept and see that value and see the impact. And so using examples to then show how it's worth the money, it's worth the time and effort to implement this. That's the role I'd see of the owner.
I would also like to add, I was actually inspired with what you just said earlier, that we're already building assets from the very beginning of the project, whether we're setting up expectation and making sure that we, as the client, having this conversation with leaders as far as what to expect when you're in the space. But the underlying to that as well is we're creating efficiency, because we're running it from like design, build, construction, and operations, and we're already engaging it and using that assets basically to use it for experience, for virtual reality or mixed reality. So it's one platform already, and so we're using that for different pillars at the life cycle, whether it's a project or operations.
And I can add just one more thing, is how do you bring down the threshold of the technology so it becomes really easy? You mentioned 40 seconds. And then Matt mentioned simplifying the VR, so it doesn't have to be like a perfect twin of the reality, because like then your mind wanders all over. So how do you laser focus on the one thing that you want to represent in the model? But I think that threshold is really important to get in. I think during the pandemic we all learned about VC conferencing, and I think like Zoom and other platforms really brought down that threshold. Is you walk into a room and press one button. How can we do the same? You talked about that QR code. I think it's fantastic. How can we be even more simplifying things and lowering the threshold for technology?
Yeah, and I would add to that. It's really, again, setting expectations, making it really easy. less overwhelming, and it's really important in the setting expectations across. It should be with the owner, with the designer, and with your own team that's building the project to really what to expect of what the technology has to offer. Because most of the times when you see something pitched in this fashion to say, hey, we're going to use this technology, it's going to be awesome, it's going to make your lives easier, sometimes the perceivance is, oh shit, another app that I need to learn. So just making it really easy for folks is kind of the thought while you set that expectations. And one thing that I've observed is when you're presenting a technology to your team, really have that presenter be the end user themselves rather than, in this case, like a VDC engineer or a manager. Because the perception sometimes is like, oh, it's a VDC thing. I don't have to know about this. But if a superintendent is presenting this technology, that's where you get the more buy-in. And the owner actually understands that, yeah, this makes sense. They seem confident. They seem comfortable. I think this is a good way to sort of scale this and use this technology.
Yeah, I'll follow up on that to close out. The curve I showed about the active practitioners and crossing the chasm, that's exactly right. Like, none of the folks in that active practitioner, like, they want to see one of their peers who they know and trust do it successfully and have seen it done, and that it helped them achieve what they wanted, a happy client and all this stuff. They want to see that before they'll believe it and actively engage in it, I think. And so we need active use cases. I think the lowering of the barrier is really important because, you know, HOK, on behalf of the design team, in order to win the project, so Meta puts out an RFP for a design team, right? We're coming in, we know we've got 3 or 4 competitors who are all really good too, and we try to get a low enough fee that we can win the project, and you get it, right? Once you got the project, the design team's gonna wanna use this on everything. It's cool, it's fun, it's really effective. Every project also has a project manager who's like, that's great. We don't have the time or the fee or whatever to do it, right? Except on the larger projects. And so lowering the barrier will help with that. And then what we try to do, and it's not just VR, it's anything else, is like, in order to get successful implementation, those folks in the industry, designers, need to see their peers doing it successfully, that a client is raving about it, but then also that the project manager is not going to nix it and that it was successful. And it wasn't, you know, it's one thing to do it successfully, but if you also lost money on the project, that's not going to happen on the next one, right? And you can only do that 2 or 3 times before it gets a bad reputation, and it takes several years for it to get back up. Revit went through that cycle, I feel like. So, yeah, that's been our experience. So we're just trying to get as many success stories as we can and then go advertise them internally, and that's how we'll get there, I think.
Thank you. Thank you. I will have one more question, and then maybe we can have questions from the audience. Then we can continue with additional questions. So we heard about each of your organization had a transformation process, because this was a relatively new implementation, and use cases are emerging every day. And twofold question I would like to ask, both from AEC professionals and also newly graduating students. What skills and experience do you think it's valuable to prepare an organization through this transformation process?
I'll start this time. I think really what we're doing is leaning into the younger generation and the design principles, the folks who are never going to learn this technology, you know, but they see the value in the folks that their teams have done, and the fact that actually the barrier is so low now that, you know, folks in the first 2, 4, 5 years of their experience, that they're really good at this and they can help and show that off to a client and then make a design principle look really good in front of that client. That's what we're seeing. And so in preparing for this presentation, I put a call out to our entire firm, give me your best examples of some of this stuff going on. I think 4 or 5 years ago, I would have gotten a small handful, and this time I got dozens, more than I could have shown, which I think is a really good indication. But that's our younger folks learning the software, whichever tool that you want to use to this, and then showing it. But then also, largely, it's again, folks seeing their peers. For us, our senior principal designers are seeing their peers use this really successfully on projects, and then they're like, that's cool, I want to do that now.
I'd like to add, because I'm looking at the screen right now, the word long-term, and right now we have a great process altogether as far as the VR, whether we started in the 1990s or 15 years ago. But the long-term of it is about what is AI going to do with the long-term of this? Because right now we can build all these assets and help us to move faster and be much more efficient. but what will AI do later on? And so that outcome, there's going to be quality work, but at the same time, there's going to be efficiency work. So I think that's how we're going to look at it from the next 4 or 5 years from now.
And I'd like to also add that technology skills are a no-brainer. I mean, like, yeah, maybe the older folks will never learn that, but, you know, like, and then good technology is, the learning curve is not so steep. So it's also up to the technology to be able to teach users how to use it. But I'd like to focus on the soft skills. I think the soft skills are very important that nowadays probably gets to take the back seat a little bit. You know, like Matt was talking about, you know, like how the executives felt silly having that big thing in front of their noses. You know, like I think it's a pretty lame reason, but it's a valid reason. So how you, as a 23-year-old, convince the executives and speak up and lead by example and corral the team together to make that leap of faith that, you know, like, yeah, it's not going to bite you, you know, like it's going to help you. And I think that's probably a more harder skill than learning how to use VR.
Yeah, and I think it's we're going through that similar phase of adoption to what we've experienced with using our building information model, right? So you go through the people, process, and technology phase, and it's really the people and the process that helps us push the adoption of new technologies. And I do want to emphasize that having that barrier to entry being as low as possible really gets that adoption. And technology is supposed to make our lives easier, not the other way around. And more platforms are going to keep coming, but we need to make sure that we give them a direction and a sense of what the expectation is. And most of the times, like within the GC realm, we get hit up probably 10 times a day from different vendors, like, hey, this is a new tool, this can help you out. But having your own internal team kind of sit and think critically on what's really important for us that this technology is really helping solve, and give that kind of like a framework to the outside world really helps. Rather than saying, oh, that's a new flashy technology, let me see where this kind of fits and how I can use it. And the process should be reversed to get that adoption in a better direction.
I think the 30-second rule is like such a great representation of what it takes in industry to like force change. And so if you're young and learning this, becoming an expert where you can walk into the room, give someone headsets, and they put them on, and they're instantly transported, and there isn't a 30-minute, you know, learning session on how to learn some new headset and learn how to open an app and, you know, scroll down 20 different menus. I think that's the big part, where you can go into a room with someone who's never used it and change their perception immediately.
So I think there's, obviously, we're just starting to get into the technology, and there's going to be a lot of advancements that are going to make things easier, faster. But I would say, in terms of advice, is to try to stay tethered to those traditional skills as a designer. It's very easy to rely on technology to make decisions, to build for you. But if you're not understanding how things come together, or if you're in a room where you don't have those tools available to you, you're still going to need to draw. You're still going to need to sketch or express your ideas. And so trying to find the balance between technology and kind of the traditional methods.
Thank you very much for your insights and suggestions for both students' perspective and also for professionals. And now I would like to open the floor for questions.
I saw you first. So.
Lucky day. John Burko with Arup. So I almost feel like we're in this extended adoption phase of this technology, like abnormally extended. When I was at Bechtel, I mean, we were using VR 15, 20 years ago. And so things have gotten better, but it's still like in this, we need to do this, we need to test it on this, and it's kind of only used on these elitist projects that are very expensive or have, you know, wealthy owners or high-end construction firms or high-end architects. So I'd like to explore what the barriers are. I don't think it's age, to be honest, because at Arup, in my office, we have like 200 people on the floor. Most of them are young. I don't see any headsets on anybody's desk, so I don't think that's anything to do with it. So anyway, I'd love to get some feedback on why this adoption phase is taking so long.
As a client, I have a different perspective. It's something that I've been asking partners to develop. For example, because we're, as I mentioned earlier, we build projects 150 per year. It ranges from 2,000 square feet to 1,000,000 square feet. So we need to move really fast. So we develop a set of standards that we can upload so that we can create virtual reality. And those are a cut and paste for every single project so that we can, a 30,000 square feet project that usually run from 9 months to 12 months, we can do it. We've been challenged, and we did it for 60 days. From the minute we broke ground to the minute we move in, 60 days. And that's because we created a bunch of tools to move forward with that. So with that said, as a client, I've always asked as far as like, can we streamline this? Can we do this? And I'm not sure if there's a fear of streamlining a process with technology would eliminate some of the main roles. I was not asking for that. I was asking for efficiency, and then therefore, can technology help with that? So whether it's auto test fit for schematic design, because we all have a different set of standards, you put them together and you come into this world. I've always asked for that. And there was one company who did it before, and they showcased it to me, and they tested it on for their own project. And I think it's something that they continue to do. But it's something that we've always asked as well.
My few cents on like why is it taking so long? It's sometimes it's really hard to quantify the value. We've had some of the projects that we have submitted RFP for. Sometimes the client comes back and says, "Hey, why do we need to do BIM? That's for you guys. We don't have any benefit to it." There's some education there, and there's some adoption that needs to be discussed. And I see a similar sort of buy-in requirement to adopt something like VR or AR in a project, where we really start to educate the team and get the buy-in very early on, instead of it being an afterthought. Most of the times what happens is the project is far along, and that's when we realize, oh, there's a new exciting opportunity that we can have VR or AR workflows within our project schedule. And that's already late in the process, and we tend to lose adoption and interest. So getting the early team alignment way early on to say like, hey, this is how we are going to do our project and execute the project, and these are the tech stack, and this is how we're going to be implementing. That helps, and if it's late in the game, we lose the adoption.
And I would say that, like in order to answer that question, we would also need to know what's the endpoint, right? What's the goal line? And I don't think there is one. In fact, there's another panel discussion led by AECO called perpetual beta. So we are in perpetual, I'm just borrowing that statement, that we are in perpetual beta. And then, like once the technology gets better and we're used to that, the technology gets better again, and it's constantly moving target. So back in the old days when, like the fax machine came out, like we had to learn how to push those buttons. And there was not really a lot of, like technological innovation on that. But it also gets much more complex now, like we have to learn the complexity. Another analogy would be like driving a car. Back in the 70s, you needed to learn a few things, right? But now, like those cars come with hugely complex systems that, you also need to master. So complexity, I would say that, and also like evolution, constant evolution would be the two things that it's not really a, an accelerated process.
I think I totally agree with what he's saying. There's the tangible trade-off is really hard to measure. You get a proposal or a change order to implement some sort of VR solution, and the the benefit is there's going to be less problems. You know, there's not a, hey, we're going to save a clear way to say you're going to save this many dollars in change orders, or you're going to, you know, speed up approval times. It's there's not enough tangible meat there, and I think that's the challenge of kind of convincing teams that it's worth it.
Yeah, the two examples that I gave, the one that worked, which was just engineers and contractors sitting together and looking at a VR model of a very specific thing to try to solve how this thing is going to go, that was successful because everybody kind of understood what they were doing and it was just helping. Where I found it continue to drag, and drag is the first of all, I think the technology is not quite good enough there, and that, you know, from our perspective, an architectural designer, any owner or client meeting is really, really important to them. You know, they take that time really seriously. They don't want anything to mess up. And so if the technology is not like, I know it's going to be great, and I'm not going to look like an idiot in front of my client until it gets there, all it takes is one bad experience where they have one bad meeting and it falls down and they're like, I'm not doing that again for 2 or 3 or 4 years. And how do you fix that? At this point, I'm happy to say we've got enough design principals who have had good experiences with it, and they know how to talk to clients about don't expect perfection, but we think it's going to use it. And that's just slowly growing, but that's what I've seen as to why it's not there yet.
Sorry, one more response. And I don't know, like I don't have a true answer, but I think part of this is that we're waiting on it to be solved at a project level. Like we look at it a case by case, and so maybe what we're waiting for is like the industry shift, right? And so how does technology or how does the VR become part of like the licensing program, or how is it part of like the educating of designers, architects, and engineers?
Miha Wojtek, Mortenson. You mentioned this direction of thinking that if we're gonna do VR too early, right, we're not gonna control the conversation towards the important topics. But I'm curious if we are not closing ourselves for opportunity for discovery. I will maybe share an example. We are building a stadium a couple years back, and ballpark, not the stadium. Right before we were ready to start the construction of the suites, right? Because it's a repetitive space, we decided to do VR experience with the designer and the owner. And through that process, as the owner is walking around the island in a suite, they say like, we like everything, but we don't like the L shape of the suite, right? People will not be able to walk around it. To which the designer responded that, oh, the bartender will be serving, so people will not need to walk around it. And the owner said like, what bartender? We are like close to the situation of like building those spaces, and they were like, yeah, we talked about that like 3 years ago, don't you remember? It's like, no, we never expected to hire 30 bartenders for those spaces. So through that process of discovery, because we opened that, right, we gave the opportunity to not concentrate just on this image, this image, this image. We allowed them to experience and discover the problem that could have been solved way, way earlier, right? Luckily, we were able to avoid ordering like 30 different granite countertops and all that stuff, right? But are we maybe, and I'm an architect historically, moved to construction, are we afraid maybe that we want to control our customer and prevent them from discovery, from wondering a little bit about the space that we are designing for them? And I want to hear your, as the owner, perspective of that as well.
Oh, as well. All right, I'll start. You said, so that was, sounds like CDs had been issued. You guys were about to start construction? Yeah, it's not. Oh man! All right, so that's not great. Yeah, I think that's a fair point, and I don't want to. Yeah, I don't mean to sound Weasley if I'm like we don't want to show it because we don't want to, have them point out things and everything. I feel like the client's got such an important role in this in terms of their understanding of the technology, and if you're gonna, so that would have been much better done in schematic design or DD, right? Where you could have actually impacted like, okay, well then we're not going to do this, or you are going to hire bartenders, or we're going to redesign the space. If it's not, that's appropriate in SD and DD. What that VR model would have looked like in SDDD is dramatically different in terms of level of fidelity than what you were looking at in construction, right? And so you need to have a client, I would say, or the team owner, who realizes that they're walking around a space where we haven't picked finishes yet, and the lighting fixtures aren't going to look like that. We're just looking for operationally walking around, and have a client that's educated and understands that and can make decisions on that basis. Then I think it's perfectly successful. I think the issue is that a lot of clients have a lot of things that are on their plate that are not looking at design stuff, and they're not accustomed to seeing the stuff that we do all the time. And so it's a little bit of a conversation with the client about, if we're going to do this early, just know that this is what you can expect and this is what you don't, and there's still going to be that a little bit, but that's my thought.
As a client, I think the engagement early on with our leader, Mark, or my previous boss, John Tananis, it was really important to have a defined program, what we need, whether we're building a building or a bowling alley or a community hub. We need to have a very specific program of what we need. From there, the alignment between our main client, which is Mark or John, sitting down from the very beginning of the project with the main architect, Frank Gehry in this case, capturing that requirement basically is a good first start in aligning. Then after that, putting all of those into the design, and because he's asking for a space for one big room with 3,000 engineers, you can't really experience that on paper. So putting this model on a headset for him to walk around, to see the volume of the space, to see the sight line, 24 feet high ceiling, 450,000 square feet of an open plan. Can you just imagine the volume of that space? So he's asking for something that, he wants to be efficient with his engineers. So putting into that perspective, that was important for us to put it in the headset for our client. When it comes to specific details, whether it's the color of the carpet of that paint wall, we as the subject matter expert, we put a lot of thought into it. Data, science, focus group study, all of that are done in the back end of it or in parallel while we're designing that.
I think maybe one thing to add, like to the situation that you describe, that would happen one way or the other, right? Whether it's through the rendering that now it's caught late, that some things may be not aligned. Better that than if it's framed and now we're catching it as it's, as it's being fully realized.
I see one more question. I think you had a question, right?
Thank you for your fantastic panel and talks. This is a question for Varun, and maybe if anybody else wants to add. You talked about champions, right, for the adoption of technology. What's the persona of great champions that you've experienced? And number two, all contractors and design firms and architects have subcontractors on the team or subconsultants on the team. So how do you navigate the adoption of technology, not just by your own people, but also those subcontractors who may have different scales or different level of technological maturity? So if you can comment on these two aspects. Thank you. My name is Pooja Jain. I'm with WSP.
Great question. On the champion side, when we say finding that champion is really a critical part, right? So at least the qualities that come up to me when I'm thinking about Few in my mind is really being patient with the technology, get to know the ins and outs of what it has to offer, and really making sure you're available for the folks that are using the technology whenever they need. So it's really also understanding what the end user really cares about using this technology. All of the augmented reality solutions that we have deployed, when we look at our user engagement and who is actually utilizing these tools, to our surprise, it was not really our general contractors. It was always our trade partners who are essentially using this technology more than anyone else on the project team. And when we kind of got that data point, we talked to a few folks who have been using this, and the conversation with them went in a way where, yeah, I'm okay with this, be it this technology or anything else. I'm able to access and visualize what I'm going to be installing in an easy fashion. That's the only reason I keep going back to it. So speak to what the end user really cares about rather than giving them 10 different things that this technology could do. Think about what they really care, and I think that's what helps with the adoption.
And then I can address the second part of the question on the personalities. I think it's a really interesting question, and my team has been doing persona studies and also like technology penetration and that kind of stuff. And I don't have a definitive answer, but I think, you know, if the technology solves your problem or helps you solve the problem, kind of like that WIFM, right? What's in it for me? How can it help me do my job faster, better, more precisely? I think that's the right track, because, you know, like, we are not using technology for the technology's sake. We are using technology to aid or augment a problem. So I would say that that's sort of the problem solving part. But of course, you have to be flexible and open-minded and most of all curious, I think. So like that's probably the persona part.
And just to round that up, right? So when we think about how we are building stuff, it's a little bit backwards. And what I mean by that is we start building in 3D, we convert it into 2D, and we give that to our people who are putting work in place. They look at it, they try to decipher how it's going to look in 3D. And the question that I often get asked to my surprise is, hey, do you build models out of the 2D drawings? Like, no, that's how the shop drawings are generated from the coordinated models. So it's essentially giving access to them in order for them to imagine what it's going to look like right at the front. And that's what's going to help.
I think it's a great question, actually, on a lot of fronts. I think it applies to sustainability and AI and everything also. What I found, and maybe for everybody, for all the grad students coming up and you're interested in doing this, I find that with the adoption of any of this technology, you know, if you're a champion to whom? Your audience, if they're senior practitioners or leaders of the firm or whatever, what I've seen is if you show them something cool and everything, they're not going to remember the technology. They're going to remember you, right? They're going to think that's that cool thing that Susan did or whatever, you know? And the way you get to that, I found, is understanding what they've done, I think. And so if you're talking to active practitioners, say, away from the screen, not holding a box, not anything, just having a conversation, and say, okay, I understand you're probably having these challenges, we're just having a coffee or whatever, and only after you've established that and kind of explained it a little bit and asked a lot of questions, then you can say, I think I have something that's going to help you, and then you kind of dive in. I've seen that. You also asked a good question about the sub-consultants. What we do on this and on a bunch of other things like embodied carbon and things like that is we write that into our sub-consultant agreement. So if we're going for a project, that's a sub-consultant agreement. So anybody who wants to be on our team has to say, yes, I'm going to do a whole building life cycle assessment. Yes, I'm going to follow your BIM compliance measures. Or a lot of local small firms, which are important to be on the team, can't do that, but at least that lets them raise their hand and be like, I don't know how to do any of that stuff. And often in those cases, we'll say, okay, well, then this is going to be a project in which we're going to mentor you and get you up to that level. So that's doesn't work perfectly on everyone, but that's how we're trying to approach it.
I'd like to use an example of one of our sub-consultants who their specific role is to specify kitchen equipment to support XYZ of Meta employees. So they would lay out all the kitchen equipment, but for us, it's our job to simulate it as far as the different times, different queuing lines, so that we can address how they're specifying all this different equipment and what type of footprint they're taking over. By having that technology to our sub-consultants, kitchen equipment specifier, they're able to see what they're asking for on a shop drawings or millwork or a 2D plan. So that helps them as well. It helps us as well to be efficient in how we design our cafe.
Thank you. Thank you. Do we have one more? Do we have time for one more question?
Hi, Charles Ma, Scoreboard AI. A question for Varun and maybe anyone else on the panel as well. The site link demo that you showed was pretty detailed in terms of modeling plumbing fixtures and ducts. Like, what percentage of the projects that you do have modeling down to that level of detail, and also who does the modeling?
Yeah. The project example is that I've given is for a huge healthcare medical office space, right? And we try to define within our execution plan and bid documents in terms of what the requirements for the trade partners are. And when we define that, we define it in a way where we are actually speaking to how it provides value. And it's not in a fashion of like, hey, this will help cover our basis or anything as such. And that's really how we do work. VDC is part of our company strategy, and when we interview the partners that we'll be working with, we want them to have the same side of industry thought and approach. And we as a team decide what's important to model and what not within our responsibility matrix. And we know our partners and what they're capable of once they are onboarded. We further have conversations if a certain element that needs to be modeled makes sense or not. A simple example could be, do we need to model all conduits that are less than 1 inch? Well, let's talk about why it's important for us to see it in the first place. And if as a team we agree that it makes sense to have that being modeled, that's the approach that we take. We never say thou shalt do the way and we want to see all the conduits less than 1 inch model. That's never going to fly, and it's going to lead into a not so collaborative environment. So it's really a collaborative process where we put that responsibility matrix and LOD matrix.
I've got a follow-up, sorry if that's all right. I know that's breaking the rules. I'm just curious, for your MEP systems, everything you're talking about, the ductwork, the conduit and all that, do you tend to expect that or want that from the design engineers or from your trade partners?
Yeah, I think when we look at our coordination sequence, we have design coordination and then we have trade coordination. And we clearly define what's the level of detail requirements within the design phase. And we talk it from the standpoint of how it really helps us. Is it helping us from spatial coordination standpoint, or is it helping us get permit with less back-check comments? So that's how we define the level of detail within design. And then within fabrication, I think most of the mechanical and mostly mechanical and sheet metal, their way of actually fabricating the sheet metal relies on that LOD 400 model anyways, and we take advantage of that.
Thank you. Before we conclude, maybe one more question on next year. We learned from you and your experience from now, and I'm curious, and maybe our audience is also curious. Let's go fast forward to 2025. When you are here next year, what would you like to talk about? What's exciting for you for the upcoming year, and what do you see yourself sharing next year?
I have one. Me and Terry and James are working on a project right now to re-envision one of our oldest campuses. We moved in 15 years ago. A year from now, I'd like to be able to come with our headsets and fly through a fully completed design that we've gotten buy-off from our leadership, from the engineering groups that are going to sit in the building, and our contractors that are going to build it, and have everyone sitting there ready to start construction.
So earlier I spoke about how we were kind of retroactively going through and scanning our portfolio to create the tours. Part of what Solon's talking about is a new project, and it would be great if it wasn't a post. It was that model or that experience is being built up for something that we can internally use as a cultural icon for tours and storytelling.
Page turns that takes 2 to 3 a week of physically looking at stacks of set of drawings. Hopefully, we're not going to do that a year from now. We are going to use our headset to address conflicts and design, because I've been to some of those projects where we use the headset to address conflicts and redesign it. Hopefully, a year from now, we're all at the same page. That's one. And that we're leveraging AI to help us as well with what we need to address, or an algorithm as far as, some things are a risk. But more importantly, still all of us in the same room, putting in that employee experience or that human experience that we all need in order to create an environment that is really harmonious for everyone.
I think connecting the dots there about AI and machine learning, right? So it's really important for us within the company to think about how we are organizing the data and how we can help the industry. That's something that we need to be thinking about. And when we look at all of the back-end data right now, sometimes it's pure garbage, sometimes it's something helpful. So really, when you kickstart a project, really think about how you could help towards the end of that project to share that data to help get better LLM agents or better large language models that'll help the project access the information very easily and train these models to be more efficient is probably something that I'm really looking forward to.
And I talked about a few experiments that my team has been doing or will be doing or is doing. And I think coming back and share some learnings from that. And I'd like to also throw it out to the audience and my partners here that like sharing things that hiccups or things that didn't work well that we can learn from. And many times it's not the technology, but it's that human component or that threshold that we talked about, and how can we lower that and how can we resolve that. I think that would be really interesting to talk about next year.
I'm going to have to ask permission from my client here, but I'm thinking of a very specific project that we're designing right now for Meta, and I would be interested in talking about whether we could use that as a case study to try out some of this stuff. Say go? Yes? We talk afterwards. Yeah.
This is great. Thank you so much.
I just want to add one more thing. We didn't talk about labs just in general, but we're starting to also upload all of our labs virtually, so that in the spirit of like sustainability or the need to change a lot of different things. So most of our labs are being scanned, or some of them are scanned already, so that researchers or lab scientists or lab user will be able to look into the lab, measure it right there, have that experience. And because all of the specification that they need for their equipment are already listed there, and the infrastructure standards that we had developed already are in place, we're able to see it immersively in a virtual world right now. So lab scanning and lab uploads is already something that we're doing.
Great. Thank you, Simge, for guiding us through the session, and thanks to all the speakers. I loved the range of learning about sort of at the very front end of the project, how can we get better decisions faster from the city, from the top executives, to now let's get the thing actually built that we decided a while back. And then also the story of doing that a bit faster, having less time between when we actually decided, yes, that's what we like, till we can actually not just inhabit it in our headset, but also physically. Yeah, and then the cultural aspects of really blending the physical and virtual through the scanning, and then the experiences, creating better experiences. So that, I guess if I have one wish, I would love to see next year, how can we really create better experiences? How can we understand the experiences even better? I think you started to talk about that, Gabor, and James also. Because I feel like, for me, we are designing and creating experiences for our users. And for that we need the physical spaces. But I see not so much about the physical experiences represented in those spaces yet. So maybe some students can be creative in how that could be visualized. Anyway, just a quick thought that occurred to me. I think it's time for a break. So I suggest we take a 20-minute break, come back at, 18, 19 minutes, if that's okay. Come back at 10:50, and then we will have time for breakout like we had yesterday. So at 10:50, please find 2, 3, 4, I don't suggest more than that, colleagues here, and talk about, pick up from an example that you saw and say, that was cool, and this is how it could help us, or share an application of VR, AR that you are doing or planning to do, and why that is. I know there's quite a few here in the room that have experience in this respect, and be great to be able to share that with some of the colleagues here, and then report back so we can also learn about your experiences with VR, AR, and what has made those experiences successful, and how we could overcome some of the barriers that were brought up. Sounds good? And then that'll take us to about 11:30 or so, and then at 11:40 we should have a keynote to take us to lunch. All right, well, enjoy the break, and thanks.